When I first discovered the TurboGrafx 16 console and started exploring its library of games, there were a few standouts that immediately caught my attention. New Adventure Island and Castlevania Rondo of Blood were high priorities to play, but it was actually the Neutopia series that sang its siren song to me the loudest. A few years ago, after picking up the TG16 Mini, I beat the first one, which I found to be rather middling, very prescribed, and frankly a bit boring in places. I made a video about it if anybody wants to dig back through the channel, but at that time, I was assured by the internet at large that the second game would vastly improve upon the original and sweep me off my feet. Well, it would seem that now that I'm on the other side of the credits for Neutopia II, we need to have a little talk. Neutopia II's story picks up with the son of Giuseppe, the hero from the first game. There are whisperings of Dearth, the Emperor of Darkness, rising up again, which has driven all the residents of Neutopia into hiding. After the protagonist's mother has a disturbing dream of Giuseppe's probable demise in the arms of a giant tentacle monster, you take up the role of his son and set out on a quest to find him. Along with inheriting Giuseppe's destiny-ridden blood that foists him into a role as Neutopia's new savior, the main character's father also passed on his pesky bedhead. As silly as it might seem to point out, that disheveled hair was extremely distracting across the entire game. I kept hoping for a helmet upgrade of some kind, but it sadly never came. On the topic of things that are inconsequential but thoroughly tickled me, I decided to name my character Hun as usual, but the game decided that the name I actually chose was Hun with 3 spaces at the end, since that's the way it was formatted every time my character was addressed in conversation. He was affectionately known as Hun Spaces from beginning to end. Apart from the anomalous hair, graphically, Neutopia II's world is polished and vibrant. There weren't necessarily a lot of texture details in the natural features of outdoor environments like the leafless trees or grassless terrain here, but some clever shading provided plenty of dimension and gave them some flair nonetheless. Indoors, the same crew of interlock layers must have built every single house and home in the land because other than a couple of palette swaps, most building interiors look nearly identical. This isn't unheard of in adventure games or RPGs, but there was one aspect that was a bit strange to me. The backstory talks about how the people of Neutopia were forced into hiding once the evil labyrinth started forming underground, but it doesn't really explain why nobody really has much in the way of interior decoration. Bookshelves and fireplaces are great and all, but where's the rest of the furniture? Apparently, when the big exodus happened, this person who saves your game got to the bed store first because their house is loaded with them. On an unrelated note about how these people live, I can forgive the absurdity of someone's front door being something like a tree that needs to be burned down to access their home, but how on earth did these people have time to forge and fortify houses to live underwater? Furthermore, why do they have fireplaces? How do their chimneys work? Suspending disbelief in video games is usually pretty easy for me, but this was just a bit too contrived for my tastes. Something I really appreciated about this overworld was how its areas flowed together. The first Neutopia game had a hub building that facilitated travel between several spheres, which were different regions of the world that became available one at a time as the game progressed. There was no physical interconnectivity between them, so to go from place to place, you had to set out from this one building. In Neutopia II, the world isn't completely open from the start, but you eventually get to move around freely for the most part. It was cool to see the wilderness settle in as I moved away from populated areas, or to see a sunny, lush place suddenly turn to icy winter as I approached more northerly regions. There are still some choke points that interrupt travel, like these intermediary caves that connect larger zones, but this layout was a huge improvement on the first game. Exploring the overworld in Neutopia II felt unrewarding compared to other similar titles I've played. Even though there was something to find on almost every screen, my interest and curiosity for burning bushes, bombing walls, and pushing rocks was consistently ravaged by Neutopians with a terrible habit of spoiling exactly where everything is. On more than one occasion, I had people revealing exactly how many screens and in which directions I needed to travel to get to a labyrinth. This was almost as bad as the first game's magical compass pointing in the direction of dungeon entrances, but what's extra funny in this instance is that Neutopia II's overworld isn't complicated. Each section is presented like a maze, while in reality, there's only a single path running through to the next goal with occasional small dead-ended detours. The entrances are impossible to miss since you almost always see them on the way to wherever you're going. In the event that any of them require any finagling to get into, the thinking's completely removed from the equation since someone likely spilled the beans about how to get in. I think the most egregious examples of this blatant backseating were the residents that would allude to an important character somewhere out in the world with an exotic item upgrade. They'd reveal a general direction to travel to find them, but almost 100% of the time, this mysterious person would be on the literal next screen, and very obviously so under a rock or a tree or whatever. I don't get why these developers spent so much time building up excitement around exploration when they had no intention of allowing anyone to experience it on their own terms. They seem to really want players to coast along a straight line to victories that don't even really feel earned. If I had my way, I would have indiscriminately burninated the entire countryside, including the peasants, to snuff out all of their incessant coaching. At least the music was a bright spot while meandering. Neutopia II's soundtrack is a mix of tunes from the first game and some new ones, including excellent and memorable high-energy jams. I really liked how different areas had their own unique songs, but I also found it rather strange how the borders of those places were defined here. There was one spot where it was almost like an in-game sound test. Between 3 or 4 screens, I had access to the majority of the overworld music heard throughout the whole game. Sudden music transitions were actually pretty routine here. Dead ends would often be split down the middle with some kind of obstacle between the current area and another, complete with a brand new music track. It was neat seeing a little preview into what lay ahead, but overall, I found these unexpected music jolts more confounding than anything else. Many other games I've played felt much more deliberate in their overworld planning, so the music didn't reset as often, which translated into a more cohesive and fluid experience. The dungeon music tracks were oddly serene and unexciting considering the shift in tone from the outdoor areas, though I was grateful for a little variety here too. There were multiple tracks played across the different labyrinths, including some recycled ones from the first game. One song I particularly loved was the boss theme. Its intensity and energy matched that of the impressively large and fast bosses themselves, but more on that later. The list of enemies you encounter in Neutopia II borrowed very heavily from the first game's lineup, which makes sense since their settings are supposed to be shared. The slimes are back with the pretend rocks that charge at you, right alongside flying insects that take way more hits to vanquish than they have any right to. There are quite a few nasty monsters here, like fire-breathing pharaohs that have a screen-filling damage radius as they swivel, as well as some huge floating grim reapers and satans with movement patterns that feel impossible to anticipate. The overworld screens usually provide plenty of fighting room, but the dungeons were another story altogether. The main character can move in 8 directions, but room layouts are set up with 90-degree turns that certain monsters have the luxury of ignoring while you don't. It's way too easy to get backed into a corner and bombarded, leading to what felt like cheap and unavoidable damage. While the list of enemies that tested my patience is quite lengthy, the worst offenders were these fluffy clouds that split in half when attacked. First of all, almost every time I encountered them, the doors of the room I just entered slammed shut behind me, forcing me to murder them all before moving on. These guys jump all over the place, even off the top of the screen. Their shadows are also deceiving. It looks like they jump up into the air and that you should be able to pass underneath them, but that's apparently not the case at all. As one final slap in the face, the only item they seem to drop is an hourglass that freezes their movement temporarily. You'd think that this would be a blessing, being able to make quick work of them while they're immobilized. Unfortunately, you're only able to hit them once, followed by the game making you wait for them to animate again before you can continue to slay their offspring. Definitely the most annoying enemies in the game, hands down, no question. Despite some of these annoying monster antics, the combat with melee weapons felt great overall. There were upgrades to the sword, shield, and armor that kept pace nicely with new, more difficult foes. Neutopia II also gets a huge gold star for doing one of my favorite things. The hero's sprite changes when he puts on new equipment. This sort of thing adds an extra layer of polish that I love seeing in video games, and I wish more of them bothered to do it. Anyway, the 8-directional character movement allowed for smooth and responsive sword fighting. The swords were my favorite of the standard weapons since the other 2 options, the boomerang and the flail, were literally too costly to use. The flail deducts 10 gold from your total every time you deploy it, and if you don't catch the boomerang on its return, it's gone forever. This thing costs several hundred gold, so it's not exactly worth throwing around all willy-nilly. I'm not sure why they went this far with such punishing consequences for using these items, but it certainly didn't encourage me, a hoarder of all items in gold, to try them out very much. I honestly can't imagine why anyone would want to use any of the aforementioned weapons once you get your hands on the magic wands anyway. When compared directly with the swords, the spells clock in weaker, but also have the huge advantages of better range and knocking back monsters. On the topic of the knockback, I did notice one weird thing with the magic specifically. If it went through an enemy sprite to its far side, the monster got pulled towards me instead of getting pushed away. It was almost like the collision detection acted like the magic shot was coming from the opposite direction or something. Regardless of the technical aspects here, it ended up causing a lot of strife for me. The line between when magic would push or pull an enemy was razor thin, which tacked on an extra layer of tedium to the flow of combat. I was perpetually measuring out that sweet spot on the fly, which was much easier said than done. There are multiple spell types to wield, including fire, wind, and lightning. Like the first game, the strength of the magic attack depends on whether you've met one of 3 full heart thresholds on the life bar. Basically, the more hearts you have, the more powerful the spell. You obviously don't get access to the stronger ones until later in the adventure after the health bar gets extended a few times, but even at lower strength, the fire and wind magics are a perfectly fine way to destroy monsters. Lightning's okay, but I didn't use it as much since its range and coverage area felt worse than the others. I also found it curious that the higher level spells didn't feel as good to use as the lower level ones. Most of the time they felt like downgrades, with the most outrageous example being the wind spell. It went from being an aimable, screen-crossing attack at level 2 to a spinning circle of tiny tornadoes at level 3 that was really tough to line up with anything at all. There's thankfully no magic meter that limits how much you can cast magic here, but even being able to use this an infinite amount of times in a row wouldn't have improved my ability to aim it. It's worth mentioning that I've beaten a couple of other games where the health level equates to a stronger attack of some kind. Blaster Master and Star Tropics on the NES both have slightly different takes on this mechanic, and I really enjoyed the extra layer of challenge it brought to those experiences. In theory, a video game that rewards you for playing well can be fun and even motivational. When it's done properly, your hard work directly results in a tangible advantage that's not always required to win the day, but augments the journey in an encouraging way. Where I find this kind of system tougher to swallow is in a game like Neutopia II, where keeping health topped up is extremely difficult. In particular, its dungeons are riddled with inescapable damage and nasty trolling that penalizes curiosity rather than rewarding it. The dungeons were very similar to the first games, with bombing walls, killing every enemy in a room, and pushing blocks all being possible ways to progress. There's no indication of which walls can be blown up unless you run into one of these prisoners that, just like their pals on the surface, can't help but blurt out where to place a bomb or two. As far as I could tell, there was also no way to figure out which blocks in a room could be pushed without trying them all, and boy did this take no time at all to start feeling monotonous. I can't tell you how much my heart sank every time I entered a room to the sight of blocks numbering in the double digits. Neutopia 2 is not like other games I've played where room layouts are occasionally repeated across multiple labyrinths and always have the same movable block. The one you need to push is almost always different, meaning that the majority of the time, I had to suck it up and submit myself to this nightmarishly repetitive block pushing simulator. To make matters worse here, the game commits what I'd consider an ultimate betrayal. Early on, you're taught that different colored blocks potentially have hidden stabbing blades in them, or that floor tiles with a little design on them may trigger a spike or arrow trap. In the later dungeons, they throw all the rules out the window and put these slicers and dicers wherever they like. By removing all of the visual tip-offs, just by unassumingly trying to find a way forward, you'll end up getting hurt in ways that can't possibly be anticipated. That is, unless you're tiptoeing around every single room just in case something happens, but where's the fun in that? This kind of design choice feels just plain mean-spirited. It's one thing to see a room filled with traps and be able to rationalize your way through it all, but it's quite another to be punished for experimenting with things that are normally a viable solution. Imagine if when you found a chest and went to open it, it stabbed you instead of presenting some sweet reward for your hard work. Well, guess what? That happens here too. At least in other games, when I find a mimic chest, I can fight back and get my revenge. Here, they didn't even afford me that small scrap of dignity. I honestly haven't seen traps quite this rude since playing Star Tropics, where you're often led to your doom by simply trying out a path the game's innocently laid out for you. While Neutopia II never really plunges you into an instant death situation like this, it's more like death by 1,000 little frustrating nicks and cuts that also chip away at morale and the adventurous spirit. Falling into so many snares wouldn't have been so bad if opportunities to restore health in Neutopia II's dungeons weren't in such short supply. The overworld areas are quite generous, with compassionate healers and save people topping you up right before each labyrinth entrance, as well as the option to return to any town and buy health potions at the shop. The labyrinths, on the other hand, are the definition of stingy. There may be an occasional potion or two to find, but once those chests have been opened, those items are gone for good. If you die and have to run back through a dungeon again, all the enemies respawn and you just don't have that extra help the second time around. A factor that compounds health scarcity even further is that enemies simply don't drop hearts very often. They were actually pretty rare, and if I'm not mistaken, it seemed like only certain kinds of enemies dropped them in the first place. This means that while clinging to your last vestiges of life, you might have to fight through many rooms looking for the specific monsters that drop health, only to be disappointed when they don't even hand it over. And it's not like you can just endlessly respawn enemies to try again right away either, because after clearing a room, they take a while to come back. That's if you even make it there at all, since the blocks and other hazards I mentioned earlier might take you out on the way. On the bright side, the low health indicator noise here was so subtle that most of the time it blended in with the music. As much as I was glad for the lack of shrill beeping to spotlight my brushes with death, I was often blissfully unaware of how close I was to dying. Having something slightly more intrusive sounding might have been a bit better than this. When death does take you in Neutopia II, you get to keep any progress you've made, including new items you might have found. You also lose half your gold, which became a huge limiting factor for me towards the back half of the adventure. Like most greedy salespeople in video games, vendors here jack up the prices of everything the further along in the quest you are. Gold drops from monsters are really the only way to make money, and they don't scale up along with item costs. In a situation near the end of the game where you die after using up all your bombs and medicine while exploring, the prospect of grinding up enough cash to stock up and return to the fight well prepared is daunting. If I hadn't made much progress exploring a big dungeon I just died in, I opted to reload my last save and start the whole thing over again rather than this alternative. Money drops were as infrequent as the hearts were, and shaking down miserly monsters for hours was not my idea of a good time. I also weighed out the risks of dying while grinding, and given the intensity of some of the enemies around these parts, hitting reset to get all of my inventory back seemed like a much better use of my efforts. There were two main reasons why I died in Neutopia II. The first was the very uneven difficulty pacing of the labyrinths, and the second was the bosses. The dungeons at the beginning of the game were almost laughably easy. All the hand-holding NPCs I mentioned, along with fairly simple layouts, planted seeds of misplaced confidence in me. About halfway through the game, the gloves came off, and I was suddenly faced with a huge, awful dungeon to tackle. Most labyrinths up to this point were one floor, maybe two, with a fairly straight path through to the end. Out of nowhere, they threw a massive 5-floor dungeon at me, complete with a warning from an NPC about a necessary quest item hidden behind a wall beyond what the regular map shows. This place was brimming with traps and miserable enemies that equated to what is easily the hardest stretch of the game. I feel like it was way more complex and tricky than the final dungeon, which was no laughing matter either. I don't know who decided to make the labyrinths go from feeling like a jaunty walk on a flat path to suddenly needing to scale the side of a building, but they weren't very nice. The boss encounters were all really flashy, screen-filling affairs that presented some serious challenge. If I did end up conquering them on the first attempt, it was usually by the skin of my teeth rather than some sweeping victory. Of the group, there were some that ranked further up the difficulty scale than others, and the one in particular that tied up my progress for a while was this blue jelly monster. Despite taking multiple runs at this fight, I couldn't figure out when he was vulnerable. Eventually, I just had to load up on medicine and resort to spamming magic, and he eventually died. I'd say this fight was on par with the final boss's difficulty, though the latter encounter gave me trouble for completely different reasons. I won't spoil it, but I thought the gimmick they went with was extremely clever and served as the perfect punctuation mark for a knockout boss lineup. These guys were definitely a highlight for me. Neutopia II was a heavily anticipated experience for me after the first game fell short of my expectations a couple of years ago. I was so very hopeful that the sequel would smooth out many of the things I'd classify as Neutopia's rougher edges, but unfortunately, all the second game really was more of the first. To me, it feels more like an expansion pack rather than a true sequel. Other than some awesome new music and a couple of extra magic spells, there wasn't really anything here to grab my attention or pull me in that I hadn't already seen in the first game. That's not to say that Neutopia 2's lack of experimentation is a bad thing, because if you like the first one, you're almost guaranteed to enjoy the second one too. In my case, both games feel uninspired with their constant hand-holding and wearisome dungeons. While I did like the second game more than the first by a small margin, it's definitely not something I'll be pulling back off the figurative shelf again anytime soon.